First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. We hope that you and your kith and kin are well during these challenging times, and we appreciate your time here. My name is Uma Carmarker. I'm an assistant professor with a joint appointment between the Rady School of Management and the School for Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. I have the great pleasure of introducing my distinguished colleague, Dr. Amir, Professor of Marketing and Associate Dean at the Rady School of Management. It's maybe not the most elaborate introduction that I could give you given your profound accomplishments, but hopefully you wouldn't mind if I just dive right into the topic today.
Yeah, let's dive right in. Thank you, Uma. I'm also fortunate to have Dr. Uma Carmarker, who's established in her own right, kind of moderate this webinar. Hopefully this will be interesting to all of you. So I'll switch back. The topic is the 4 stages of pandemic response. It kind of sounds like the 5 stages of coping with grief, and it is related, but not exactly the same. So what we're going to talk about today is that adaptation of those 5 stages to areas of and cases of terror attacks, dread, tragedies have seemed to follow 4 distinct stages, which, as you will see, describe the response to this current pandemic quite adequately. So the stages start with denial, and we have seen denial in lots of different levels. This is not going to affect me. It started when the whole world watched Wuhan and thought that it's their problem. That is kind of a characteristic of the denial as someone else's problem. The second one is panic. It's when people realize, oh no, my world is about to change, and I did not expect this. And we will see if we can find evidence for a panic response in the market. The next stage is survival or self-preservation. This is when people wake up from the panic a little bit to say, well, what do I need to do in order to survive this? And the final stage is adaptation, adapting to a new situation, new world, the new norm as we hear in the news. So these are the stages, and you should expect actual pandemics to influence the physical world in a very similar way to those cases of terror attacks, causing people dread and to go through these 4 stages. And indeed, we see in evidence from the media that clearly there was denial and that clearly there seemed to have been panic. Right? These are just selections from the media, but describing Wall Street as gripped with fear. It's very consistent with a panic response. But what I'm going to focus on today is what happened in the digital world. If we think about the stock market falling because there was panic, you could say, oh, well, investors realize that companies are going to have problems with employees, and therefore they're going to produce less, and therefore their productivity will be reduced, and therefore we should not value their stock as much. So you could come up with rationalizations of effects on the physical world, but as we saw, the internet was unaffected and maybe even boosted in some by the social distancing and the shelter at home. And so maybe these kind of psychology that I described, or psychological responses and stages, maybe they don't apply to the digital world, or maybe they apply differently. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And I'm going to use data from a marketplace for digital services that is called Fiverr, who is kind enough to share data that would shed light into what actually happened and what might we expect. And I'm going to try to do it using charts of data. A small disclaimer, because this is a publicly traded company, the units on the y-axis are sometimes non-existent, and some of the words I'm going to use are going to be vague on purpose. So I'm going to talk about activity. I'm not going to talk about sales or traffic sometimes in exact words. That is intentional. I also want to point out that this is an interactive webinar. All the microphones are muted for everybody's well-being, but if you have any questions, please write them via text, and then Umar, our distinguished moderator, will collect them, and in the end of this short introduction of the topic, we can open up discussions to questions that you might have, because there's a lot more than what I've selected to show you in this short time. So,
yes. Sorry, along
yes.
those lines, please feel free to put those comments in the chat as they occur to you and in the timing afterwards. And actually, if I can interject a question of my own. So you mentioned Fiverr is a digital platform. Can you mention just a thing or two about the kind of people who use the platform and what they're offering?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. So Fiverr is a digital marketplace. There are more than 350 subcategories of digital services you could contract there, and it's a digital marketplace for freelance work. So if you want a designer, if you want an editor, if you want search engine optimization, you could probably find it there for sure. If you want voiceover, or if you're offering one of those, you could also offer it through this marketplace. There are buyers and sellers. About 80% of the buyers and sellers are small businesses, small to medium businesses that conduct some of their business by outsourcing to freelance work via this digital marketplace.
So even though we can't quite walk into the local stores in person, we still have the opportunity to do an equivalent of that online.
Right, and this is more the equivalent of contracting a freelancer, meeting them at Starbucks, and deciding that you want to hire them, and starting the whole process. Okay, so did we see evidence of panic, which is the first stage? Denial is kind of a non-change in the data. So yes, a null effect shows denial. But panic is the interesting stage. Do we see panic online, even though there is actually no physical reason to panic when you're conducting digital transactions? And what I've chose to show you in this graph is first the bars. The bars are, for reference, the bars are the close values of the S&P 500 on the dates shown on the x-axis. As you can see, by March 10th, there's already panic. And we know that the stock market dropped quite a lot. As you can see on the blue line on the top, that is the activity on the Fiverr marketplace. And as might not be predicted by any physical reason, yes, there is a drop in activity in about the same place that the panic in Wall Street happens. And again, this could be a designer in England designing a logo for a small business in Germany, yet there's a decrease in activity when there's panic. At the same time, there's panic in Wall Street. And on the bottom, the black line is the sickness rate in the US, total infected. And as you can see, both the stock market panic and the decrease at Fiverr predate any real infection situation. So what I'm showing you here is what it's not really correlated with, which gives rise to the question or the hypothesis that it might actually be panic driving these decreasing activities, not sickness. For further evidence, we could look at these kind of graphs by country. And in the blue graph, again, it's going to be activity on Fiverr. And the yellow line is going to be the total number of infected people in that country. And the black line is the total number of people who died in that country. And as you can see from the various graphs selected here, between the United States, Italy, Spain, and United Kingdom, there really is not a direct relation that you could visibly see. Of course, we would conduct statistics to test this, but in terms of eyeballing this, the drops in traffic don't seem to be related to the physical characteristics of the pandemic. Okay, so you could ask, well, what are they related to? So I brought an anecdote that I kind of like because it brings a smile to my face. Here on this graph, the x-axis is dates. The blue line is activity on Fiverr, on the Fiverr marketplace, more zoomed in. And the gray bars are incidents that are correlated. Now, this is clearly just a correlation. No inference of causality is attempted, but it looks like, and it turns out, there is a significant correlation between the blue line and the gray bars. And you might say, what are these gray bars that seem to be related somehow to traffic or activity on Fiverr? And these are Trump tweets. So when Donald Trump tweets, and when the bars are high, there have been many tweets on that day. The world apparently listens and maybe panics. So this is just one example. In general, you could relate this to media posts more broadly, and you would see that while there's no relation to infection rates or to mortality rates, there's definitely relation to media coverage. And so the panic we see on this particular marketplace seems to be related to media posts. But finally,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask, in your opinion, do you think that's more because of the information that's coming in, or more just because there was a reminder of what everyone's living through, or that it's an updating situation?
Yeah, so this what Uma is asking is an empirical question, which I have not tested. But suffice it to say that these tweets here that are represented probably don't present a lot of informative content rather than opinion. And so I would probably, my hypothesis that I would test is that it is the prevalence of scary media or information rather than the information itself.
And if I may follow up with a question from the audience, since I've already interrupted you, there was a question related to whether this relationship seems stronger in March than it might be in February.
Yeah, it certainly is, but that's confounded with the situation in March beginning to be more dire and more people paying attention and more people. And remember, this is global data, so more people around the globe were facing this pandemic as time unfolded. That could be the reason why there'd be a stronger relation. But again, this is a correlation. We're not trying to make any more than that. The final evidence for panic is maybe this graph. So this graph is the number of searches for COVID-19 conducted on the Fiverr platform. And to my best ability to find, the marketplace on Fiverr does not offer any service related to COVID-19. These are people who, out of panic, instead of searching on Google, they search of COVID-19 on Fiverr. And you can see that as March unfolds, particularly around March 10th, the level of the number of searches, just people who search COVID-19, even on a website that is not related to COVID-19, is probably representative of some degree of panic. Now, moving away from panic, the next step is survival, is self-preservation. And what is interesting in the research on tragedies and terror attacks is that people seem to find solace in sociality. So think about this pandemic. It changes and threatens people's worldview and world image. People feel a lack of control. And what they do is they try to find strength in community, strength in others. And so the evidence from terror attacks was that people become more prosocial right after being exposed to something terrible. And so the simple question is, could we find evidence of sociality, of prosociality, on a mostly business-to-business marketplace for digital services? And the answer is very much so. So what I did here is I took all the messages that users send each other through the platform, where normally these are messages about, hey, I want my voiceover this way, or here is your logo that I designed for you, or can you edit my manuscript in this particular way? And so you can take a message and using natural language processing these days, come up with a score for the sentiment of the message. Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it neutral? So the y-axis here is actually the only one that's meaningful by units in this presentation. And that is 0 would be neutral, -1 would be negative, and +1 would be positive. And as you can see in February and March, that there is a scatter of sentiment, but by and large, the average is slightly, but not immensely positive, which you would expect from normal business transactions. But look at what happens in March. In March, all the messages, and there are more messages, as you can see by the shrinking gray area, which is the confidence interval, all the messages seem to become more positive and more positive as time unfolds. And that is direct evidence that people are kinder, nicer to each other, even on a business-to-business platform where they're conducting transactions relating to their business or leisure interests.
Could you give an example of one of those positive sentiments?
So a message could be, one of the messages we saw that sort of triggered this because it was sort of weird is, I hope everybody in your country is doing well. That's a positive sentiment. Thank you for doing a great job for me, especially given the situation in your country for a freelancer in Italy, right? And so these kind of pro-social positive messages have increased dramatically in the marketplace in a kind of unprecedented way. What I'm showing for February and January is the normal level that you see throughout the year.
Based on a question from Orly Lobel, do you think that these are based on kindness or optimism?
So this particular algorithm for sentiment analysis does not detect optimism differently than kindness, and so we can't tell. Anecdotally, it seems to be kindness, but we'd have to have a much more detailed analysis to be able to separate the two. And the final stage, I want to leave enough time for questions. The final stage is adaptation. Are people adapting to a new norm, a new normal that we seem to be hearing a lot about? And so I'm going to show two pieces of evidence for this. One is, as you can see, this is a zoom in to that drop I've shown you in the blue line before. Now it's the blue bars. And so you can see that the 2 weeks of panic are clearly visible here. And as you can see, after that, people are back to their usual, back to their normal, and even more so. What is interesting here is the black line. The black line is new sellers that have joined the platform. And these are anecdotally very high quality sellers. And as you can see, they begin earlier. So sellers who now realize that it's much harder to meet people at Starbucks and contract a job if I'm a designer or a freelancer for something else, they turn to online as their new norm to conduct transactions. 80% of those in the black line have never transacted on the internet before, kind of based on a survey that we conducted with that population. And so people are adapting. They're changing how they do their business to ways in which are not susceptible to the difficulties of social distancing and dealing with the pandemic. So that's evidence number one. Second piece of evidence has to do with how people behave. I don't know about your experience, but through all these Zoom meetings, someone eventually asks, what day is it today? Because when we lost our normal schedule, it's a lot harder to keep track. But what I'm showing you here is that normally, if you look at transactions and business done during weekdays, which would be 100% on this graph, transactions and business done over weekend tends to be less, tends to be, the amount tends to be lower. And in general, traditionally, it has been about 63% of the amount of business done on weekdays is done on weekends, on average per day. And what I'm showing you here is that has not changed between February 2019 and February 2020. But, and also February and March 2019 are the same. But this year, something different happened. A lot more people are transacting and doing their business on weekends. And that is definitely a sign of adaptation, where I have less opportunities to do work. I have more time on my hands, more free time. Anecdotally, a lot more people realize that they have a lot of videos that they would like edited for something. Maybe it's their family videos or something else. And so the amount of business done over the weekend days has grown dramatically. And that is another sign that people have changed of kind of their normal behavior. And for those transactions to happen, there are freelancers out there fulfilling those needs. And so that shift in the day pattern is an interesting change, an interesting sign of adapting to this new situation during the pandemic. I will end my kind of examples here. There are a lot more examples I didn't get to show you, but given this time, we'd like to have an opportunity for questions and further elaboration whenever needed.
So along those lines, there were several questions that came in related to panic. So I want to get to those in a minute, but so a follow-up to the very last slide, if you could go back one slide. You showed us these amazing changes in activity, and Daniel Reed asked whether there were changes in the average prices or rates compared to historical averages that might also be distinct or new given these differences.
Yeah, so without revealing actual prices or anything like that, I could tell you that there's a lot of new traffic coming in. And there are some signs that when they first transact, they try things out, and so they might transact slightly lower than the average in the marketplace in their first transaction, but then their second and third jump right up and transact even higher than normally, and so we see kind of an evidence that people are kind of trying to see if this is indeed going to work for them. Remember that self-preservation aspect, and as they receive good results, they adapt, and then you don't see major differences in subsequent behavior. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. So I'd also like to say that Own has generously offered his email address because you've been similarly generous with your questions, and I'm going to hope that I can get to as many of them as I can. So I'll also try and bundle some of them. Again, more related to those last couple comments, and then I'll go back to the ones related to panic. So it seems like there's this adjustment in activity, the change in prices. Did sort of combining that with optimism, Shani, I believe it's Ankorian, asked whether trust grew between people in Fiverr, like between customers and the service providers, compared to whether there was any evidence for that increase in addition to positive sentiments.
Yeah, so it's sort of, what's very interesting is that this onflow of new providers and new freelancers is on average very high quality, and so the average quality that the buyers would see if they come in also goes up, and so it's very hard to separate that from kind of a more general sense of trust. There are a lot of positive indicators that would indicate that the trust levels have gone up. It's just very hard to pinpoint exactly the source of that increase.
That's understandable. So as I mentioned, a number of questions came in the beginning and have been coming in related to how to interpret panic or the signals of panic. So for example, you noted Trump as an illustrative example. Do you think you would get the same kind of reaction from when I believe Dr. Fauci, I believe his name's pronounced, would speak, or when he and Trump were in conflict, as Peter Gorovich asked?
Yeah, so again, that's an empirical question, and it's testable if you actually have all those instances in the data. We could definitely look at a correlation. What we saw is that the drop in activity seemed to be correlated with the volume of media engaged. And so a hypothesis you could draw is that it's the sheer volume of media focused solely on this that fuels panic.
Yeah, so from multiple sources. A couple of questions related to the general scope of these stages, and I assume the boundaries on them are quite blurry anyway, despite the progression that you've shown. So a very specific question from Matthew Hoffman. Could the Fiverr search spike for COVID that you showed early on be from people who went through those 4 stages quickly and then are already adapting by looking at how the market reacts, sort of getting their own data from Fiverr itself?
Yeah, so it could, and we know that there are vast individual differences in how people cope. We know that there are some that never really adapt, and there are some who don't move past denial. Even in this dire world situation, we can see evidence for that. It's a little hard to think that people are doing research on COVID-19 in Fiverr because it's over the wrong place to do research for it. So I still interpret that as sort of a mistake. The cause of that mistake is kind of anybody's guess. That's why I said it's consistent with panic, but it could mean lots of different things.
So I should note that we are just about at 12:30. We did start a couple minutes late. I'd like to follow up with one question, but I understand that some of our guests would have to take off for other Zoom meetings or activities. Can we can, if there's additional time for us, we can go back to some of the additional questions, but in terms of the future, are corporations using these types of freelance platforms? Is the use of the platform in general and its relevance potentially increasing in the new situations? And what, even more broadly, do you have specific predictions or things that you think that this can help us think about the future?
Yeah, so I think that every company is trying to assess how permanent and stable the changes that they see are, and that is an interesting challenge. What is definitely true, and we see this with lots of remote services, be it groceries brought to your home or prescription drugs brought to your home, or digital services that you could contract remotely. There's definitely a significant subset of the market that says, oh, wow, I actually realized that there's value here. And there's a paper by Todd Rogers and colleagues that identifies different characteristics that could lead to persistence in behavior. And one of them is realizing that there's actually value that you haven't anticipated before. And one of the things we're seeing in the case of a marketplace like Fiverr is that companies are realizing that there's stability in the remote, online, global nature of a marketplace like this, where even if one country got hit pretty badly to disrupt normal operations, other countries that are represented might not have. And so getting access to remotely to a global marketplace offers a lot of stability. And so we see that there are companies that hang on to that in this uncertain world and say, at least I know I can get my so-and-so done without worries in the time I need it. And so there's definitely evidence that some of the shifts we're seeing are going to persist.
And in fact, some of the statements you made reflect some of the questions and suggestions that had come in. Lev Kurbanyan was asking whether this might be, some of these dynamics might be related to unemployment changes more broadly, or different changes in employment or different relationships between companies and their employees.
Yeah, and so I think that our time is limited, but just to throw things out there, there's definitely a realization that things could be done remotely that many people did not have before, and so to the same degree, if you realize that you could get some of your business needs done remotely without needing to go to a coffee shop to meet a freelancer, that realization is going to stay. Yeah. And so, and as the data I've shown, a lot of the freelancers, quality freelancers that have not needed to find customers online before are now doing that. And they're going to realize this is a viable, fruitful channel
mm-hmm.
for at least some of their work. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason they would stop that because they benefit from it.
So as you and I have discussed in the past, one of the challenges with applying these models is that in many cases, like the 5 stages of grief, there's an event that you can't reverse. And we have this tension between everyone wanting to go back and then adaptation to a new normal.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what companies need to be doing right now. They need to be figuring out how much of the changes they're seeing they expect to persist and how many would revert given more freedom to travel and things like that.
Well, I think that offers us a good stopping point. Thanks again to those who stayed with us for those extra minutes and for joining us during this conversation. Thank you, Own, for this incredibly fascinating piece of work relating the business world to these models and back and forth.
And thank you, Uma, for taking the time to moderate so well.
My pleasure. It was easy with you guys. Do well, everyone. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you, everyone.